Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Debbie Epstein Henry. I'm the founder of DEH Consulting, Speaking and Writing and an executive consultant to Axiom. And I'm delighted today to have the opportunity to interview my friend and colleague, Ricardo Anzaldua, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Freddie Mac. And we're here to talk today about the topic, how to bolster your legal team as business and talent leaders. Welcome, Ricardo. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Debbie. How are you?
I'm doing okay. These are indeed very strange times, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to chat with you today. We first met in 2017 when I spoke at an event with Sunny Hostin of ABC News and former McDonald's GC, Gloria Santona. And the topic then was the age of accelerating complexity. Can law firms survive? And I think this notion of the age of accelerating complexity is more apropos than ever. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that topic before we get into the topic at hand.
Well, without a doubt, complexity is the order of the decade, probably the order of the century. Everything becomes more and more complicated as time passes. We have new challenges thrown into the mix. We have a pandemic, obviously. We have organizational complexity. We have new social challenges that we're confronting, a new administration with new priorities, and an old administration that threw another monkey wrench into the way that we think about our democracy. So yes, indeed, increasing and accelerating complexity.
Absolutely, and I wish we had more than just our 45 minutes to dig into many of these topics, but we will do our best to cover as much as we can. So turning to today's topic, how to bolster your team as business and talent leaders, can you walk us through some of the highlights of your career, and in doing so, share what experiences and qualities have been most helpful to you in building your team as these business and talent leaders?
Well, thanks. I began my legal career at Cleary Gottlieb Steen and Hamilton, and I became a partner with the firm in 1999. I think that one of the big takeaways, one of the big development moments for me at the firm was really learning to be even-keeled, to be able to really confront any new situation with equanimity and calm. And that's a really, really important talent for all lawyers, to be able to take a look at a stressful situation and evaluate it with ice water in your veins, as it were. You have to be able to be calm and think through the issue and try to eliminate or try to put aside the emotion that it causes in you so that you can be an effective advisor. From there, I went to the Hartford. At the Hartford, when I was a year in, we experienced the Great Recession. We experienced the meltdown of the capital markets. It was really an extraordinary opportunity for me. I was brought into the company to manage a team of 50 around the corporate support, the support for the holding company. And that meant that I was in charge of the legal team that was responsible for doing things like raising capital for the company, which became the primary order of the day from late 2008 until mid-2010. So I had the opportunity to show the company that I could lead gigantic, complex projects like those, like executing on a capital investment, private capital investment over a weekend for north of $3 billion, getting the entity qualified to receive TARP financing from the US government. We were not a depository institution, so I had to turn us into a depository institution in 30 days by acquiring a bank, and then qualified the company to get another $3.5 billion in TARP financing. And the combination of those two transactions were what really saved the company financially. It was in meltdown from $105 a share at the beginning of 2008 to $2.50 a share at the beginning of 2009.
Wow.
Hartford today is a healthy company largely reliant on those two big infusions of capital that happened in late 2008 and early 2009. And as I have gone through my career as an in-house counsel, I have really learned about building teams in-house, about the importance of advancing diversity in a team in-house, and really structurally how to approach the question. Thinking about diversity as a long-term commitment and not something that is really achievable in terms of the overall organic structure simply by recruitment. It also takes investment in people. It takes the creation of competencies and skills, and it entails the nurturing and development of corporate executives to function within the legal organization. So I've worked on those things at MetLife, and I've done it again at Freddie Mac.
I love the way, and I know this about your background, of course, from our prior conversations about how your successes in leading in disruptive times have been so inextricably linked with development of a diverse team, and your experience at MetLife and what you did there and sort of revamping the talent system, and then what you're doing now at Freddie Mac to extend that whole programmatic structure has been really key, I understand, for your success. Can you dig in a little bit more into that and talk about how you have been effective at building inclusive teams, and specifically the steps that you took before, but importantly are taking now to really continue in that direction?
Sure. You know, an extremely important element of building diverse and inclusive teams is at the beginning making sure that you have structures in the organization that are designed to address the development needs of every single person in the organization. The task of building a diverse leadership pipeline and creating diverse leaders in the organization necessarily entails that you're going to have to invest in top talent who is diverse. But you can't do that if you haven't made a commitment, if you haven't gotten the organization feeling like everyone is being taken care of. Then investing in just a few people to advance them will create a mutiny within the organization. So there has to be an overall organizational commitment to professional development for everyone on the team. That's the foundation that you need to lay. Then after that, you can create a program whereby you will use bias blind and, to the extent possible, objective methods for identifying who are the top talents in the organization who need to be invested in so that you can create the diverse leadership pipeline. So you have to go through a selection process. You have to identify the universe of the personnel that you're going to focus on. So I typically begin by focusing on individual contributors and identifying those who we think could make good leaders and good managers in the future, and then start investing in them, linking them up with sponsors, putting them into situations where they can get stretch assignments, giving them additional training in areas where they may have gaps, whether it's technical knowledge or emotional intelligence, executive presence, communication abilities. You know all these things, Debbie. These are things that you work on, and those are the things that you have to invest in to take somebody who is a shining star potential leader from an individual contributor position into a leadership position. In Freddie Mac, in addition to this, I have a situation where I have a very senior heavy population of individual contributors. So besides doing that for the population that's there, I also have to at the same time build a seniority pyramid so that we can recruit new talent into the organization and give that talent the opportunity to advance without requiring that they instantly become candidates to be part of the senior leadership. So give them a chance to grow, develop, distinguish themselves, and make themselves into candidates for future leadership by showing us that they are top talents and have the aptitudes that are necessary in order to become a leader in a corporation.
It's so smart. And you mentioned obviously organizational structure and such an important piece of this. I recently interviewed Dolly Chugg, the bias expert, and she talked about her interview of one of the top people at Salesforce and how he's the chief equality officer. And he talked about how one of the most important things they did at Salesforce was focused on their meetings and running better meetings. And she initially, as this bias expert, was like, running better meetings, like, why is that so critical to the issue of bias? But who is at your meetings and how those meetings are run and who speaks at those meetings and who doesn't, that's all about an inclusive workplace. So I just love that example around structural change, which I know is such a big part of what you did both before in MetLife, but also in Freddie Mac.
Exactly. And, to the point that you raise, a lot of it entails training of your leadership. So there are habits already existing in every organization about how meetings will get put together, for example, or how matters will get staffed, for example. And a very sort of volitional approach to diversity is important if you're actually going to build an inclusive personnel combination and workforce. So retraining the way that leaders think about these things is a very important element.
And how has this changed in light of George Floyd's murder? And what does this look like in terms of building an inclusive workplace and the priorities for companies like yours for non-diverse lawyers as well as diverse lawyers?
So, I think that the underlying truth of it is that not much really has changed. I mean, if you really thought about this issue and you understood what your challenges are, what are the hurdles that you have to clear in order to create a diverse workforce, not much has changed. It's still the same thing. But what has changed is people's awareness of their own biases, people's awareness of how they really had not thought about the world as it appears through the eyes of another person, through the eyes of a diverse person, for example. And I think that it's been extraordinarily enlightening for many people in the world to see that they really had not been aware of, for example, their own white privilege, aware of the incredible advantage it is to be able to leave your house, walk on the street, and not worry about a threat being directed at you because of the color of your skin or because of maybe your sexual orientation and so forth. And gender, it also has a dimension here. I think that lots of male leaders are realizing that they haven't really thought about hurdles, obstacles to advancement for women. So all of these things have started to emerge from the self-awareness produced by George Floyd's murder and the need for self-reflective approach to personnel issues and to leadership within the organization.
Agreed. And some of the reading around this talks about how for it to really resonate with people, it either has to be a personal thing, the father who has 3 daughters who suddenly becomes a real feminist, that's personal to him. But if it's not personal, how do we get people to have that greater empathy and understanding? And part of it is through stories and images. And I think that was one of the sadly most powerful pieces of the George Floyd murder, is being the visual of it for people to say, I can't not see this anymore.
Right.
So you also mentioned, Ricardo, of course, the pandemic, and I want to move to that a little bit and talk about what your vision is for the future of remote and hybrid work. And how are you, as a leader, creating an environment that provides flexibility, but also continues to build culture, community, engagement, and opportunities for organic collaboration?
So I think that the first order answer to that question is that the pandemic will inevitably create more opportunities and more, call it, demand for remote work. I think that there's no question that the fact that so many organizations have demonstrated themselves to be effective at conducting their business with most or even all of their personnel working remotely makes that an inevitability. But what we have not tested is how this works over time. And I find that thinking about the issues of organic development of the organization, creation of new leaders, promoting people to officer positions, making sure that managers and mentors and sponsors have real connectivity with the junior people that they're trying to bring up through the organization. I find those questions almost imponderable if we're dealing in an exclusively remote working environment. So I think that probably for some purposes, a hybrid model at least is going to be necessary.
I interviewed for this same series recently Kelly Tullier, the general counsel of Visa, and she talked about her history of running a global team. And part of why she felt the remote work was working so well is that reservoir of goodwill that she had already built up with her colleagues. So there is at least that familiarity. It's much more challenging, of course, when you're onboarding people, or like you talked about with junior talent. But I want to follow up and ask, what do you think has been the most effective way that you have led in this remote environment? What have been the strategies that have been most successful at, to the best of your ability, replicating the connection that happens when we're in person?
Well, one thing that we did was at the beginning, we just started doing weekly check-in with the entire team. So there was a lot of unease, a lot of concern, doubt, uncertainty about what was going to happen. How long was this going to last? What were going to be the messages from leadership within our division and from the company in this new environment? And so I and the CEO both did weekly check-ins with the team. And I think the leaders of the other divisions did likewise, really until the point when it started to feel burdensome, when people felt like, okay, we know how we can work in this environment. We know that things are going to muddle along in this form for the indefinite future. And so, having an hour every Friday with Ricardo was probably just more of a burden on the calendar than it was reassuring. So we separated the meetings out. We held them bi-weekly for the rest of the year. I think starting in the summer, we moved to bi-weekly. And then just recently, we have decided to move to monthly check-ins. So, keeping the connectivity is very important. Also, doing check-ins with skip level, right? Making sure that people who are not my direct reports also feel like they have connection to me and an opportunity to talk to me. The social justice moment that occurred at the end of May, early June, was a real opportunity for me to demonstrate that if not my door, at least my video screen was open so that if people wanted to raise a concern, they could raise it with me directly. And it has happened on a pretty recurring basis ever since the George Floyd murder, that I will get a call from anybody from, an associate general counsel to an administrative assistant calling to raise some issue or other, or a suggestion that they have about something that we could address. So all of those things have helped in terms of effective leadership through the pandemic.
I think having the presence of mind as you have to know to shift is so critical, because things that worked last March, of course, are not resonating in the same way. And so I've seen the leaders who are doing best in this regard are the ones who are more agile and being able to readily assess their employees and their team and know how those demands and pressures and environments are changing. I think that's critical. I also am interested in hearing from you. Your business, obviously, like so many, has changed since the pandemic. So how has your team, as well as outside counsel and alternative legal service providers, how can they serve as business accelerators and allies to stimulate the pace of the business and bring the most value, and also just understand the current status of the business? What do you recommend along those lines?
This goes back really to the top of the show where we were talking about complexity. I think that the legal team has the ability to lead in kind of unique ways, and making sure that business partners are aware of the creativity that you bring to the business. How could we do things a little bit better? How could we introduce some more efficiency to the way that we carry out transactions, for example? How can we reduce the number of bumps in the road in closing a deal? There's just all these different things. We have a huge intake function in our litigation area because obviously we write these billions of dollars worth of mortgage-backed securities every year. And each one of those mortgage-backed securities is backed by thousands of loans. And every time something happens with one of those loans, we get a piece of mail into our organization. And so we have had to figure out how to use automation and artificial intelligence in order to process that and make the human contribution more valuable rather than just sort of sorting the mail. So there are all these different ways that the legal team is able to make new contributions and demonstrate its value to the organization. But it's especially creativity and nimbleness.
And are there any examples, either from colleagues, and not naming any names, but colleagues or outside counsel, or again, ALSPs, who have really been a standout to you because of something they've done? Is there some example you can share which really, really rose to the occasion or exceeded expectations for you?
Well, the one that comes to mind is the golden ring strategy that we adopted for the shift from LIBOR to SOFR-based interest rates, variable interest rates. So as many may know, LIBOR is in the process of being phased out, and we needed to come up with a strategy for migrating to a new variable interest rate base. And one of our outside counsel came up with a very, very elegant strategy for wringing off the risk of litigation, minimizing the risk of litigation, because as a matter of analytical necessity, some people are going to end up better off with the change, and some people are going to end up worse off with the change from one variable base to another. And so we had to come up with a strategy that demonstrated that we had made the election that we did without any bias, without any intent to advantage one group or another, and that we made that decision early enough that anyone who was uncomfortable with what they predicted to be the outcome had the opportunity to get out of their investment and avoid taking the risk that they wanted, that they were going to have to take as a result. So a very, very extraordinary piece of analysis.
It's a great example. And I just wonder, for the more junior lawyers out there who are listening, and I, by the way, want to encourage those listening to put questions in the chat box, and I'm happy to weave them in as I put my questions to you, Ricardo. For the more junior lawyers, what do you recommend for being able to anticipate different types of needs, to be that special person, to get, as you talked about, the sponsor's attention, really to be a differentiator? Because I think so many people right now are struggling with, how do How do I stand out in an invisible workplace?
Well, I think that the key is to get deep understanding of the value that you're contributing, deep understanding of the objectives of your client, so that you can really think through what is most valuable for the client and be sort of Johnny on the spot to identify opportunities to do what the client wants done better. Um, and if you identify those opportunities and can raise them appropriately within your organization, that is the best and quickest way to stand out.
I talk a lot in my communication recommendations about knowing your audience. There's no greater power than knowing your audience so that you can be more helpful, more responsive to their needs, tailor your messaging to address their challenges. So it's really in keeping with what you're suggesting there. In planning for 2021, I'm wondering what new factors were you incorporating into your planning, and how will you evaluate your own success at year end?
Well, there are a couple of obvious ones. I think that in 2021, at least some of us are going to be returning to in-person work at the office. And so we've been thinking about, how to organize ourselves. We've been thinking about, how people are going to participate in the in-person portion of work as opposed to the remote work. And we already talked about that a little bit. The other big thing is really the change in administration. So our priorities in 2020 and before had really been focused on the exit from conservatorship for the government-sponsored enterprises, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And so, we had been really focused especially on the need for and the opportunity for raising private capital. I think that, as a matter of general policy, our regulator continues to be focused on exit from conservatorship. However, the practical opportunity to raise capital from private sources is really not there. We now have a huge gap between the amount of capital that we now have and the amount of capital that we will need in order to exit conservatorship. And the gap is really too great to be filled by private investment in the near term. And so, we needed to shift our focus and, be thinking about making sure that the organization is very efficient, that it's running, in accordance with what the conservator wants us to do, but really focused a little bit more on making sure that we're serving our mission, making sure that we are a safe and sound institution, and not so much focused on raising private capital. So the focus has shifted, and we need to be working on being an outstanding organization, but without the elements of sort of evolution into a new phase that we had in the past year.
So you talked before about creativity, and I imagine the challenges that you're facing now will involve a lot of creative solutions that will need to be developed. And I just wonder, with a legal team, how do you stimulate or cultivate that skill? Is that something that you find in your lawyers, that you're identifying that when you're recruiting them? Are those the types of things that you can develop in people? What is sort of innate and what can be grown in a lawyer?
So I think that there's some DNA in there that needs to be there in order for you to be able to develop creativity in a lawyer. I can talk about a few elements of it. I mean, for sure, intellectual firepower is one. A demonstrated intellectual curiosity is a second one. I also think that really creative people seek to be understood. They communicate in ways that are very direct, and they're intended to be, very effective exchanges of information and ideas. I think that those kind of building blocks are necessary in order to really develop a creative lawyer. After that, it goes to what we were talking about before in terms of having a very deep understanding of your client's objectives and knowing the client and what the client wants, right? So that, if when you understand your audience, then you can be creative in a way that the audience appreciates and can use. And so I think that those are the things that you need to do, and those are the things that a sponsor can use to work on in order to develop a protege.
And when you're working with outside counsel or ALSPs, are you finding there's certain things, particularly in this climate, that are big differentiators, that this is really a draw to you when you're going outside? And are there certain things that are particularly frustrating to you right now that you really feel are pet peeves that you don't want to hear from outside counsel or, again, ALSPs?
I don't think that there's anything that's a particular pet peeve. Um, I do bang the door. I ring the bell about diversity a lot. I think that law firms, many law firms, and not so much ALSPs, but especially big law firms, tend to regard diversity and inclusion as kind of a secondary activity after the delivery of the services and being, the best advisors that they can. And I understand why they think that, but I think that many of them really need to raise it up to the top level. They need to understand that diversity and inclusion won't happen unless it's part of the fabric of the firm. That needs to be a part of the way that they do business, and not something that they turn their attention to after they have done their work and earned their hourly rates. It needs to be built up from the bottom and incorporated into the way that they deliver services.
There's been a lot of research coming out in the pandemic, the McKinsey report and others, about how women are disproportionately burdened by childcare and house care responsibilities. And in turn, it is negatively impacting their success at work. Either they're voluntarily reducing their hours because they're homeschooling and so overburdened, or that they went in certain workplaces where it's becoming voluntary to come back, they're not coming back at the same numbers, so that they're being penalized in that regard. So I just wonder your thoughts on what the impact of the pandemic is in light of that context around the research, and also what your thoughts are for diverse lawyers generally in working in a remote environment. Are there more risks associated with that invisible work environment?
I can't speak to other organizations, but I can talk about the Freddie Mac legal organization. We've been very thoughtful and reflective about this, and have been working on, first of all, making sure that we offer many different alternative modalities for people to work to incorporate their work into their other home responsibilities. And the pandemic has made it very, very complicated, especially insofar as school-age children are concerned, and care for children in the home. So we've decided to become as flexible as we possibly can. There were suggestions about how to reorganize the workday so that we could accommodate child care and other family care responsibilities, and quickly came to the conclusion that there's no one size fits all. Restructuring the workday is not going to work, no matter what you pick. It's not going to work for everybody. Everybody's has her own needs and her own challenges. So we've tried to do things like change the hour at which meetings begin because of remote learning requirements, and I think that that's worked to a certain extent, but it's hard to impose those kinds of requirements on our clients, for example. So, being agile and flexible, I think, are the ways to address these issues, to be accommodating, to let people reduce the number of hours if they think that that's the solution for them, and not to penalize them as a result of the reduction of hours. And if we can accommodate somebody taking a leave, well, we have not very many people have asked to take leaves, and we've accommodated all of them. But making sure that we don't throw up barriers to advancement as a result of the accommodations that people have had to seek in order to cope with the pandemic. But overall in the economy, overall in the sector, I am almost certain that the pandemic will have some adverse impact on diverse lawyers. It's just inevitable.
It's interesting to reflect on it, because often I find as a work-life expert that when something's mandated, it can actually be a beneficial impact, because everybody is, in this case, working from home. And so that can be a great equalizer. But I think the challenge, of course, and the complement to that is there'll never be equity in the workplace until there's equity at home. So even if it's mandated in terms of the work environment, you've still got the other side of the coin, which is inextricably linked right now, of course. So I think being mindful of it is critical. One suggestion one law firm managing partner made to me, which I just thought was so basic, but also so smart, is that as his firm is going into a hybrid model, they're actually continuing to mandate virtual meetings when some people are in the workplace and some people are working from home, so that you don't have that feeling that you're the one who's not on the line like everybody else. And so it is, again, an equalizer. So I think it's really important for all of us to be thinking about how that integrative process works as we transition back, and to be mindful of it, as you've discussed.
Right.
I'm curious with you, Ricardo, just in terms of your day-to-day, what are your biggest stresses right now in running your team, and what helps to allay those concerns that you have popping up every day?
Well, my particular stresses are really arising out of changes in leadership within the organization. So, our CEO announced his departure in November, so he's just departed. We have a new president who is not the CEO, but he's actually functioning as the chief operating officer for the corporation. And so there are new lines of accountability. I think I'm much more visible to the board of directors than I was when I was reporting through a CEO. And there are lots of sort of changes to policy, changes in approach to regulation, to the board oversight, and so forth and so on. So, all of these shifts and the addition of new bosses is, creating additional stresses for me and for my team. So there are many new things to do, and at the same time, we're looking at what's happening on the regulatory side. How is it changing, and how might it change further as the new Biden administration takes hold and starts to impose its policy priorities on our activities.
It's interesting looking at you as a leader while you are facing a lot of change in surrounding you. I'm sure your team is looking to you more than ever to have that magic mix of conviction and humility in the role that you play, because you can help strengthen their anxiety, or I should say buffer their anxiety, because they're, I'm sure, observing those same changes as well. And I imagine you're doing that really effectively from what I know about you in our years of overlap. So I want to conclude, Ricardo, with, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, that's right. That's right. We'll do a follow-up interview later on this, right? I want to conclude, Ricardo, with a parting message from you, either something that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure is part of this conversation, something I've omitted or gotten wrong, or something that we've just briefly touched on that you think is important to give a little more airtime before we wrap up?
So the one thing that I would give a little bit more emphasis to, we barely touched on the change in administration, but I think that people should be very, very mindful that there is a dramatic shift in policy focus coming down the road. And we've seen it just begin to emerge. But there's going to be a hugely different emphasis on the role of labor in society. There's going to be a hugely different emphasis on clean energy as a policy priority and as a target for government investment. We should be looking at these things in terms of the impact that they're going to have on the economy and the impact that they're going to have on us as the interpreters of law and regulation. There are many, many executive orders that have already been issued. I think that a fair number of those are going to be incorporated into legislation. And we all need to be thinking about how this changes the way that we need to support our business clients, our corporations, and really sort of also the dimension, the impact that that's going to have on the social justice dimension of corporate bodies. So I think that there is a lot of change on the horizon, and we really need to be thinking about how to be prepared for that change, and be helping our CEOs and our senior executive teams and our boards of directors to anticipate those changes and be prepared for what they need to do as a result.
It's a really important point to end on, and I think in light of the fact that we're just in January now and really anticipating what this year may look like, and with the new administration, I think it's got to be something that we have top of mind all the time. And given, of course, all of the stress that was involved right before the transition in the administration, that also it should heighten all of our awareness in terms of having that preparedness like you emphasize. So Ricardo, thank you so much for this conversation. It's a pleasure to see you again. I hope you stay safe and well and doing the great work that you continue to do. And I want to thank Axiom so much for this discussion. Thanks again.
It's been a pleasure.